Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading from Heidi, starting with Chapter 18, Winter in Dorfley. The snow was lying so high around the hut that the windows looked level with the ground, and the door had entirely disappeared from view. If Uncle had been up there, he would have had to do what Peter did daily, for fresh snow fell every night. Peter had to get out of the window of the sitting room every morning. If the frost had not been very hard during the night, he immediately sank up to his shoulders in the snow and had to struggle with hands, feet, and head to free himself. Then his mother handed him the large broom, and with this he worked hard to make a way to the door. He had to be careful to dig the snow well away, or else as soon as the door was opened, the whole soft mass would fall inside. If Peter had not cleared away the snow each day, a severe frost would have made such a wall of ice in front of the house that no one could have gone in or out. Excuse me, for the window was only big enough for Peter to creep through. Uncle had kept his word and was not spending the winter in his old home. As soon as the first snow began to fall, he had shut up the hut and the outside buildings and gone down to Dorfley with Heidi and the goats. Near the church was a straggling, half-ruined building which had once been the house of a person of consequence. One of the men of Dorfley had gone to fight in Spain and had there performed many brave deeds and gathered much treasure. When he returned to Dorfley, he spent part of his money in building a fine house with the intention of living in it. Excuse me. But he had been too long accustomed to the noise and bustle of arms and the world to care for a quiet country life, and he soon went off again, and this time did not return. When, after many long years, it seemed certain that he was dead, a distant relative took possession of the house, but it was already badly in need of repair, and he had no wish to rebuild it. So it was let to poor people who paid but a small rent, and when any part of the building fell, it was not rebuilt. As long ago as when his son Tobias was a child, Uncle had rented the tumble-down old place. Since then, it had stood empty, for no one could stay in it who had not some idea how to stop up the holes and gaps and make it comfortable. Excuse me. Otherwise, the wind and rain and snow blew into the rooms, so that it was impossible even to keep a candle lighted. Anyone who had tried to live there would have been frozen to death during the long, cold winters. Uncle, however, knew how to fix things up. As soon as he had made up his mind to spend the winter in Dorfley, he rented the old place and worked during the autumn to get it sound and tight. In the middle of October, he and Heidi moved down there. In the back of the house, in what had been a large hall, Uncle had put up a wooden partition and covered the floor with straw. This was to be the goat's house. Endless passages led from this. Through the holes in the walls of these passages, the sky and the fields and the road outside could be seen at intervals. At last one came to a stout oak door leading into a room that still stood intact. Here the walls and the dark wainscoting remained as good as ever. In the corner was an immense stove reaching nearly to the ceiling. It was covered with white tiles in which were painted large pictures in blue. There was a seat around the stove so that one could sit at one's ease and study the pictures. These attracted Heidi's attention as soon as she and her grandfather arrived, and she ran and seated herself and began to examine them. But when she had gradually worked herself round to the back, something else attracted her attention. In the large space between the stove and the wall, 4 planks had been put together, as if to make a large box for apples. There were no apples inside, however, but something Heidi had no difficulty in recognizing, for it was her very own bed with its hay mattress and its sheets and the sack for a coverlet, just as she had it up at the hut. Heidi clapped her hands for joy and exclaimed, "Oh, Grandfather, this is my room. How nice! But where are you going to sleep?" "Your bed must be near the stove, or you will freeze," he replied. "You may come see my room if you want to." Heidi got down and skipped across the large room after her grandfather. He opened a door at the farther end leading into a smaller room which was to be his bedroom. Then came another door. Heidi pushed it open and stood amazed, for here was an immense room like a kitchen, larger than anything of the kind that Heidi had seen before. There was still plenty of work for the grandfather before this room could be finished, for there were holes and cracks in the walls through which the wind whistled. Yet he had already nailed up so many new planks that it looked as if a lot of small cupboards had been set up round the room. Heidi was delighted with her new home. She slept soundly in her corner by the stove, but every morning when she first awoke, she thought she was still on the mountain. Her first impulse was to run outside at once to see if the fir trees were so quiet because their branches were weighed down with the thick snow. She had to look about her for some minutes before she felt quite sure where she was, and a certain sensation of trouble and oppression would come over her as she realized that she was not at home in the hut. Excuse me. But as soon as she heard her grandfather's voice outside, she remembered everything and jumped happily out of bed. On the fourth morning, as soon as she saw her grandfather, she said, "I must go up to see grandmother today. She ought not to be alone so long." But the grandfather would not agree to this. "Neither today nor tomorrow can you go," he said. "The mountain is covered fathom deep in snow, and the snow is still falling. The sturdy Peter can hardly get along. A little girl like you would soon be smothered by it, and we should not be able to find you again. Wait a bit till it freezes. Then you will be able to walk over the hard snow." Heidi did not like the thought of having to wait, but the days were so busy that she hardly knew how they went by. Heidi now went to school in Dorfley every morning and afternoon, and eagerly set to work to learn all that was taught her. She hardly ever saw Peter there, for as a rule he was absent. The teacher was an easy-going man who merely remarked now and then, "Peter is not turning up today again, it seems, but there is a lot of snow up on the mountain, and I dare say he cannot get along." Peter, however, always seemed able to make his way through the snow in the evening when school was over, for he generally paid Heidi a visit then. One morning, the whole mountain glistened and sparkled like a huge crystal. When Peter got out of his window as usual, he was taken by surprise, for instead of sinking into the soft snow, he fell on the hard ground and went sliding some way down the mountainside before he could stop himself. He picked himself up and tested the hardness of the ground by stamping on it and trying with all his might to dig his heels into it, but even then he could not break off a single little splinter of ice. The alm was frozen hard as iron. This was just what Peter had been hoping for. He knew that now Heidi would be able to come up to them. He quickly got back into the house, swallowed the milk which his mother had ready for him, thrust a piece of bread in his pocket, and said, "I must be off to school." "That's right, go and learn all you can," said the grandmother encouragingly. The door was quite blocked by the frozen snow outside, so Peter crept through the window again, pulling his little sled after him, and in another minute was shooting down the mountain. He went like lightning, and when he reached Dorfley, which stood on the direct road to Mayenfeld, he made up his mind to go on farther, for he was sure he could not stop his rapid descent without hurting himself and the sled too. So down he went till he reached the level ground, where the sled came to a pause of its own accord. Then he got out and looked around. The impetus with which he had made his journey down had carried him some little way beyond Mayenfeld. He thought that it was too late to get to school now, since lessons would already have begun, and it would take him a good hour to walk back to Dorfley. So he took his time about returning, and reached Dorfley just as Heidi had got home from school and was sitting at dinner with her grandfather. Peter walked in, and since on this occasion he had something particular to tell them, he began without a pause, exclaiming, as he stood still in the middle of the room, "She's got it now." "Got it? What?" asked the uncle. "Your words sound quite warlike, General." "The frost," explained Peter. "Oh, then now I can go and see grandmother," said Heidi joyfully, for she had understood Peter's words at once. "But why were you not at school then? You could have come down on the sled," she added reproachfully, for it did not agree with Heidi's ideas of good behavior to stay away when it was possible to be there. "It carried me on too far, and I was too late," Peter replied. "I call that being a deserter," said the uncle, "and deserters get their ears pulled, as you know." Peter gave a tug to his cap in alarm, for there was no one of whom he stood so much in awe as Alm Uncle. "And an army leader like yourself ought to be doubly ashamed of running away," continued Alm Uncle. "What would you think of your goats if one went off this way and another that, and refused to follow and do what was good for them? What would you do then?" "I should beat them," said Peter promptly. "And if a boy behaved like these unruly goats and he got a beating for it, what would you say then?" "Serve him right," was the answer. "Good. Then understand this. Next time you let your sled carry you past the school when you ought to be inside at your lessons, come to me afterwards and receive what you deserve." Peter now understood the drift of the old man's questions, and that he was the boy who behaved like the unruly goats. He looked somewhat fearfully toward the corner to see if anything happened to be there, such as he used himself on such occasions for the punishment of his animals. But now the grandfather suddenly said in a cheerful voice, "Come and sit down and have something to eat, and afterwards Heidi shall go with you. Bring her back this evening, and you will find supper waiting for you here." This unexpected turn of conversation made Peter grin with delight. He obeyed without hesitation and took his seat beside Heidi. But the little girl could not eat any more in her excitement at the thought of going to see grandmother. While Peter was eating, Heidi ran to put on the warm cloak Clara had sent her. As the two walked together, Heidi had much to tell Peter. The children had nearly reached their destination before Peter opened his mouth. He appeared to be so sunk in thought that he hardly heard what was said to him. As they neared home, however, he stood still and said in a somewhat sullen voice, "I'd rather go to school even than get what Uncle threatened." Heidi was of the same mind and encouraged him in his good intention. They found Brigitte sitting alone knitting, for the grandmother was not very well and had to stay in bed on account of the cold. Heidi had never before missed the old figure in her place in the corner, and she ran quickly into the next room. There lay grandmother on her little poorly covered bed, wrapped in her warm gray shawl. "Thank God!" she exclaimed as Heidi came running in. The poor old woman had had a secret fear at heart all through the autumn, especially if Heidi was absent for any length of time. Peter had told her of a strange gentleman who had come from Frankfurt and who had gone out with them and always talked to Heidi, and she had felt sure he had come to take her away again. Even when she heard he had gone off alone, she still had an idea that a messenger would be sent over from Frankfurt to get the child. Heidi went up to the side of the bed and said, "Are you very ill, grandmother?" "No, no, child," answered the old woman reassuringly, passing her hand lovingly over the child's head. "It's only the frost that has got into my bones a bit." "Shall you be quite well, then, as soon as it turns warm again?" "Yes, God willing, or even before that, for I want to get back to my spinning. I thought perhaps I should do a little today, but tomorrow I am sure to be all right again." The old woman had detected that Heidi was frightened and was anxious to set her mind at ease. Her words comforted Heidi, who had in truth been greatly distressed, for she had never before seen the grandmother ill in bed. She now looked at the old woman seriously for a minute or two and then said, "In Frankfurt, everybody puts on a shawl to go out walking. Did you think it was to be worn in bed, grandmother?" "I put it on, dear child, to keep myself from freezing, and I am so pleased with it, for my bedclothes are not very thick," she answered. "But, grandmother," exclaimed Heidi, "your bed is not right because it goes downhill at your head instead of uphill." "I know it, child. I can feel it," and the grandmother put her hand to the thin, flat pillow, which was little more than a board under her head. "The pillow was never very thick, and I have lain on it now for so many years that it has grown quite flat." "Oh, if only I had asked Claire to let me take away my Frankfurt bed," said Heidi. "I had 3 large pillows, one above the other, so that I could hardly sleep. Could you sleep like that, grandmother?" "Oh, yes. The pillows keep one warm, and it is easier to breathe when the head is high," answered the grandmother, wearily raising her head as she spoke, as if trying to find a higher resting place. "But we will not talk about that, for I have so much that other old sick people are without, for which I thank God. There is the nice bread I get every day, and this warm wrap, and your visits, Heidi. Will you read me something today?" Heidi ran into the next room to get the hymn book. Then she picked out the favorite hymns, one after another, for she knew now just which ones the grandmother liked best. She was as pleased as the grandmother to hear them again after so many days. The grandmother lay with folded hands while a smile of peace stole over the worn, troubled face. She looked like one to whom good news had been brought. Suddenly Heidi paused. "Grandmother, are you feeling quite well again already?" "Yes, child, I have grown better while listening to you. Read it to the end." The child read on, and when she came to the last words, "As the eyes grow dim and darkness closes round, the soul grows clearer, sees the goal to which it travels, gladly feels its home is nearer." The grandmother repeated them once or twice to herself, with a look of happy expectation on her face. And Heidi took equal pleasure in them, for the picture of the beautiful sunny day of her return home rose before her eyes, and she exclaimed joyfully, "Grandmother, I know exactly what it is like to go home." A little later, Heidi said, "It is growing dark and I must go. I am so glad to think that you are quite well again." The grandmother took the child's hand in hers and held it closely. "Yes," she said, "I feel quite happy again. Even if I have to go on lying here, I am content. No one knows what it is to lie here alone day after day, in silence and darkness, without hearing a new voice or seeing a ray of light. Sad thoughts come over me, and I feel sometimes as if I could not bear it any longer, and as if it could never be light again. But when you come and read those words to me, then I am comforted, and my heart rejoices once more." Then she let the child go, and Heidi ran into the next room and bade Peter come quickly, for it had now grown quite dark. But when they got outside, they found the moon shining down on the white snow, and everything as clear as in the daylight. Peter got his sled, put Heidi at the back, he himself sitting in front to guide, and down the mountain they shot like 2 birds darting through the air. When Heidi was lying that night on her high bed of hay, she thought of the grandmother on her low pillow, and of all she had said about the light and comfort that awoke in her when she heard the hymns. She thought, if I could read to her every day, then I should go on making her better. But she knew that it would be a week, if not two, before she would be able to go up the mountain again. This was a thought of great trouble to Heidi, and she tried hard to think of some way which would enable the grandmother to hear the words she loved every day. Suddenly, an idea struck her, and she was so delighted with it that she could hardly bear to wait for morning. So eager was she to begin carrying out her plan. All at once she sat upright in her bed, for she had been so busy with her thoughts that she had forgotten to say her prayers, and she never now finished her day without saying them. When she had prayed with all her heart for herself, her grandfather, and the grandmother, she lay back again on the warm, soft hay and slept soundly and peacefully till the morning broke. Chapter 19, The Winter Continues. When Peter walked into the large room at Uncle's the next afternoon, Heidi immediately rushed forward and took hold of him. I've thought of something, Peter, she said quickly. What is it? He asked. You must learn to read, she informed him. I have learned, was the answer. Yes, yes, but I mean so that you can really make use of it, explained Heidi eagerly. I never shall, said Peter promptly. Nobody believes that you cannot learn, nor I either now, said Heidi in a very decided tone of voice. Grandmamma in Frankfurt said long ago that it was not true, and she told me not to believe it. Peter looked rather taken aback at this piece of news. I will soon teach you to read, for I know how, Heidi went on. You must learn at once, and then you can read 1 or 2 hymns every day to grandmother. Oh, I don't care about that, he grumbled. This hard-hearted way of refusing to agree to what was right and kind, and to what Heidi had so much at heart, aroused her anger. With flashing eyes, she stood facing the boy and said threateningly, if you won't learn as I want you to, I will tell you what will happen. You know your mother has often spoken of sending you to Frankfurt, that you may learn a lot of things. I know where the boys there have to go to school. Clara pointed out the great house to me when we were driving together. And they don't go only when they are boys, but have more lessons still when they are grown men. I have seen them myself, and you mustn't think they have only one kind teacher like ours. There are ever so many of them, all in the school at the same time, and they are all dressed in black as if they were going to church, and have black hats on their heads as high as that. And Heidi held out her hand to show their height from the floor. Peter felt a cold shiver run down his back. And you will have to go in among all those gentlemen, continued Heidi with increasing animation, and when it comes to your turn you won't be able to read and will make mistakes in your spelling. Then you'll see how they'll make fun of you. Well, I'll learn then, said Peter, half sorrowfully and half angrily. That's right, we'll begin at once, Heidi said cheerfully. She dragged Peter to the table and brought her books. Among other presents, Clara had sent Heidi a book which the little girl... Among other presents, Clara had sent Heidi a book which the little girl had decided would serve very well for teaching Peter. It was an ABC book with rhyming lines. Peter had such trouble reading the first sentence that Heidi took pity on him and read it for him. ABC must be learned today, or the judge will call you up to pay. I shan't go, said Peter absently. Go where? Asked Heidi. Before the judge, he answered. Well, then make haste and learn these 3 letters so you won't have to go. Peter went at his task again and repeated the 3 letters so many times and with such determination that she said at last, You must know those 3 now. Seeing what an effect the first 2 lines of verse had upon him, she thought she would prepare the ground a little for the following lessons, and she began to read aloud. D-E-F-G must run with ease, or something will follow that does not please. Should H-I-K be now forgot, disgrace is yours upon the spot. And then L-M must follow at once, or punished you'll be for a sorry dunce. If you knew what next awaited you, you'd haste to learn N-O-P-Q. Now R-S-T be quick about, or worse will follow, there's little doubt. Heidi paused, for Peter was so quiet that she looked up to see what he was doing. These many secret threats and hints of dreadful punishments had so affected him that he sat as if petrified and stared at Heidi with horror-stricken eyes. Her kind heart was moved at once, and she said, wishing to reassure him, You need not be afraid, Peter. Come here to me every evening, and if you learn as you have today, you will at last know all your letters, and the other things won't come. But you must come regularly, not only now and then as you do to school. Even if it snows, it won't hurt you. Peter obeyed Heidi's instructions punctually, and every evening went diligently to work to learn the letters, taking the sentences thoroughly to heart. The grandfather was frequently in the room, smoking his pipe comfortably while the lesson was going on, and his face twitched occasionally as if he was overtaken with a sudden fit of merriment. Peter was often invited to stay to supper after the great exertion he had gone through. That richly compensated him for the anguish of mind he had suffered with the sentence for the day. So the winter went by, and Peter really made progress with his letters, but he went through a terrible fight each day with the sentences. He got at last to you. Heidi read out, And if you put the U for V, you'll go where you would not like to be. Peter growled, "Yes, but I shan't go." But he was very diligent that day, as if under the impression that someone would seize him suddenly by the collar and drag him where he would rather not go. The next evening, Heidi read, "If you falter at W, worst of all, look at the stick against the wall." Peter looked at the wall and said scornfully, "There isn't one." "Yes, but do you know what Grandfather has in his box?" asked Heidi. "A stick as thick almost as your arm, and if he took that out, you might well say, 'Look at the stick against the wall.'" Peter knew that thick hazel stick and immediately bent his head over the W and struggled to master it. Another day the lines ran, "Then comes the X for you to say, or be sure you'll get no food today." Peter looked toward the cupboard where the bread and cheese were kept and said crossly, "I never said that I should forget the X." "That's all right. If you don't forget it, we can go on to learn the next, and then you will have only one more," replied Heidi, anxious to encourage him. Peter did not quite understand, but Heidi went on and read, "And should you make a stop at Y, they'll point at you and cry, 'Fie, fie!'" All the gentlemen in Frankfurt, with tall black hats on their heads and scorn and mockery in their faces, rose up before his mind's eye, and he threw himself with energy on the Y, not letting it go, till at last he knew it so thoroughly that he could see what it was like even when he shut his eyes. He arrived on the following day in a somewhat lofty frame of mind, for there was now only one letter to struggle over, and when Heidi began the lesson with reading aloud, "Make haste with Z if you're too slow, off to the Hottentots you'll go," Peter remarked scornfully, "I dare say when no one knows even where such people live." I'm sure Grandfather knows all about them," said Heidi. "Wait a second and I will run and ask him, for he is only over the way with the pastor." She rose and ran to the door to put the words into action, but Peter cried out in a voice of agony, "Stop!" He already saw himself being carried off by Alm Uncle and the pastor and sent straight away to the Hottentots, since as yet he did not know his last letter. His cry of fear brought Heidi back. "What is the matter?" she asked in astonishment. "Nothing. Come back. I am going to learn my letter," he said, stammering with fear. Heidi, however, herself wished to know where the Hottentots lived and persisted that she should ask her grandfather, but she gave in at last to Peter's despairing entreaties. She insisted, however, on his doing something in return, so not only had he to repeat his Z until it was so fixed in his memory that he could never forget it again, but she began teaching him to spell, and Peter really made a good start that evening. So it went on from day to day. The frost had gone and the snow was soft again, and moreover fresh snow continually fell, so that it was quite 3 weeks before Heidi could go to the grandmother again. She threw herself into her teaching even more eagerly so that Peter might make up for her absence by reading hymns to the old woman. One evening he walked in home after leaving Heidi, and as he entered he said, "I can do it now." "Do what, Peter?" asked his mother. "Read," he answered. "Do you really mean it? Did you hear that, grandmother?" she called out. The grandmother had heard and was already wondering how such a thing could have come to pass. "I must read one of the hymns now. Heidi told me to," he went on to inform them. His mother hastily brought the book, and the grandmother waited in joyful expectation, for it was a long time since she had heard the good words. Peter sat down to the table and began to read. His mother sat beside him, listening with surprise, and exclaiming at the close of each verse, "Who would have thought it possible?" The grandmother did not speak, though she followed the words he read with strained attention. It happened on the day following this that there was a reading lesson in Peter's class. When it came his turn, the teacher said, "We must pass over Peter as usual, or will you try once more? I will not say to read, but to stammer through a sentence." Peter took the book and read off 3 lines without the slightest hesitation. The teacher put down his book and stared at Peter, as at some out-of-the-way and marvelous thing unseen before. At last he spoke. "Peter, some miracle has been performed upon you. Here have I been striving with unheard-of patience to teach you, and you have not hitherto been able to say your letters. And now, just as I had made up my mind not to waste any more trouble upon you, you suddenly are able to read a sentence properly and distinctly. How has such a miracle come to pass in our days?" "It was Heidi," answered Peter. The teacher looked in astonishment toward Heidi. "I have noticed a change in you altogether, Peter," he went on. "Formerly you often missed coming to school for a week or even weeks at a time, but lately you have not stayed away a single day. Who has wrought this change for good in you?" "It was Uncle," answered Peter. With increasing surprise, the teacher looked from Peter to Heidi and back again at Peter. Every evening Peter read one hymn aloud. So far he obeyed Heidi. Nothing would induce him to read a second, and indeed the grandmother never asked for it. His mother, Brigitte, could not get over her surprise at her son's attainment, and when the reader was in bed would often express her pleasure at it. On one of these occasions, the grandmother answered, "Yes, it is good for him to have learned something, but I shall indeed be thankful when spring is here again and Heidi can come. The hymns are not the same when Peter reads them. So many words seem missing, and I try to think what they ought to be, and then I lose the sense. The hymns do not come home to my heart as they do when Heidi reads them." The truth was that Peter arranged to make his reading as little trouble for himself as possible. When he came upon a word that he thought was too long or difficult, he left it out, for he decided that a word or two less in a verse where there were so many words could make no difference to his grandmother. And so it came about that most of the principal words were missing in the hymns that Peter read aloud. We'll stop there today and start tomorrow with chapter 20. Thank you. Bye-bye.